The Order of the Phoenix was born in a time when shadows lengthened across Britain and the air seemed to tighten with fear, long before the first curses were spoken in open battle. It began in the mind of Albus Dumbledore, who had seen enough of history to recognize when it was repeating itself, and he knew that the rise of Tom Riddle, now calling himself Lord Voldemort, was not the sort of threat that could be faced with ordinary measures. So he gathered those who would listen, witches and wizards, who were not content to pretend that the world would right itself, who were willing to risk their lives in defiance of the tide. And he gave them a name that promised both renewal and fire, the Order of the Phoenix. At first it was only a handful, people Dumbledore trusted most. Old students who had proven themselves and colleagues who had stood against cruelty before. And they met in cramped rooms with curtains drawn, speaking in low voices about raids that had already begun, about families that had disappeared, about the dark mark that had appeared above cottages where laughter had once lived. And in those meetings there was fear, but also resolve, because if Voldemort built his army on terror, then Dumbledore would build his resistance on loyalty, friendship, and a stubborn refusal to surrender. Among the first were James and Lily Potter, still young but fierce in their belief that the world their son would inherit had to be defended. Sirius Black, with a reckless grin hiding the weight of family betrayal on his shoulders. Remus Lupin, quiet and steady though carrying his own curse. Alastor Moody, already scarred from too many duels but tireless in his commitment. The Prewett brothers, who laughed even as they trained until laughter became memory. The Longbottoms, both bright and brave, and many others, whose names history would not remember, but whose choices carved the path forward. And together they swore not with pomp or ritual, but with the simple act of showing up again and again, no matter how dangerous the call. The world outside their circle was shifting quickly, Voldemort's followers moving with masks and with certainty, attacking Muggle-borns and half-bloods, coercing pure-blood families into silence or service, and every week the Order's members returned from missions more battered, more tired, but still alive and still determined. And they developed ways of speaking without words, ways of vanishing without trace, ways of holding together under pressure that would have cracked others, because they knew they were outnumbered and that the ministry was too slow, too cautious, sometimes too compromised to see the storm forming right in front of it. The Order's beginnings were marked by small victories and heavy losses, stopping a raid here, saving a family there, burning through the night to erase marks that were meant to terrify, and every time they succeeded, they knew it was temporary, because Voldemort's power was growing, but still they pressed on, because every day bought was a life saved. Every night survived was a chance to try again, and this relentless rhythm became their way of living. Always alert, always listening for news of another attack, always returning to Dumbledore's side to plan the next move. It was not only battle that defined them, it was also the bonds that grew in the quiet moments. Meals shared in safe houses, jokes traded even when nerves frayed, arguments over strategy that revealed how much they cared. And in those moments the Order felt less like an army and more like a family, a chosen one forged in fire and trust. And for many of them that was enough to keep going, because what they fought for was not abstract, it was each other, and the hope that someday children could sleep without fear of waking to screams in the night. The rise of the Order did not go unnoticed. Voldemort learned of them quickly, and he despised them not only for opposing him, but for the way they carried themselves, because they fought not for power, but for people. And he could not understand loyalty without fear. He sent his followers to crush them, to kill them in their homes, to mark them as examples. And though many fell, the Order endured, because every loss hardened their resolve. Every betrayal only confirmed that their cause was just, and their symbol, the Phoenix, became more than a name, it became a truth. that they would rise again and again no matter how many times they were struck down. And so in those first years, before the war became the storm it would soon be, the Order of the Phoenix stood as a small fire in the dark, flickering but refusing to be extinguished, a defiance that promised the fight was only beginning. The Order of the Phoenix had been born in whispers, but it did not remain small for long, because Voldemort's first war grew with the speed of a storm. And as the shadow lengthened across Britain, more witches and wizards found themselves forced to choose between silence and defiance, and those who could not stomach silence sought out Dumbledore, swearing themselves to his side even though they knew it meant painting a target across their backs. And with each new name, the Order expanded into something more than a handful of friends. It became a network of watchers and fighters, a circle of people who lived each day as if it might be their last, and carried on anyway, because they believed that standing still was the same as surrender. The war outside their meetings grew harsher with every season. Voldemort's Death Eaters attacked openly now. Houses burned in the night, with the dark mark shimmering above them like a sneer. Whole families vanished without trace. Muggle-borns fled in fear, and the Ministry staggered between denial and paralysis, infiltrated by spies and hobbled by hesitation. And so the Order took on tasks no one else dared, smuggling families to safety, breaking up attacks before they spread too far, planting false trails to confuse the enemy, and fighting duels in lonely lanes that ended with scorch marks on the stones and names whispered into Dumbledore's hands when someone did not return. Betrayal became a constant fear, because Voldemort valued information more than gold, and he placed spies where they would do the most damage. So the Order learned to trust slowly, and to guard their plans with secrecy, even from their own allies. And in those years, friendships were tested daily, strained by suspicion, yet somehow most endured because to break them would be to hand victory to the man who thrived on division. And still the Order bled, members killed in their homes, ambushed on roads, or simply disappearing one evening without word, and their absence hung in every meeting like a weight none could ignore. The war changed the way they lived. Meetings were held in shifting locations, houses layered with protective charms that hummed at the touch, passwords whispered through gritted teeth, and every arrival greeted with both relief and suspicion, until confirmed by countersigns. And the younger members who had once treated missions as adventure grew older in the span of months, their laughter rarer, their eyes sharper, and even in their youth they carried themselves like veterans, because war does not wait for age before teaching its lessons. The Order was never large enough to fight battles in the open field, but it struck with precision, raids on supply lines, diversions that scattered Death Eaters long enough for innocents to flee, rescues from cellars where prisoners had been kept for torture or execution. And though these victories rarely made headlines, they kept the flame alive. They reminded those still free that resistance was possible, and in the darkest nights, that reminder was worth more than numbers, because courage multiplies when it knows it is not alone. Still, for every success there were names carved into memory. The Prewett brothers, who fought until they could no longer stand. Marlene McKinnon and her family murdered in a single night. Caradoc Dearborn vanishing without trace during a mission no one would speak of again, and others whose names never reached records, but whose faces haunted the survivors. And the Order carried these losses not as symbols but as wounds that never fully closed, because they knew that to resist Voldemort meant paying a price, and many would pay it in blood. Inside the Ministry, whispers grew that Dumbledore was building his own army, that the Order was reckless, even dangerous, and some officials seemed more eager to hinder the resistance than the Dark Lord, whether out of fear or corruption. And so the Order learned to fight not only Death Eaters, but suspicion from the very institution meant to defend the wizarding world. And this doubled their danger, but also confirmed their necessity, because if those in power would not act, then someone had to, and they carried that burden because no one else would. Voldemort's power fed on terror, and he made sure the terror spread. He targeted not only fighters but families, not only enemies but bystanders, so that everyone would know that no one was beyond his reach. And this strategy worked. People lowered their heads, some even joined him to save themselves, but others turned more fiercely to Dumbledore, and the Order's circle widened again, though each new recruit meant another person to worry for, another life balanced on the edge of a wand's light, another name that might not be spoken at the next meeting. The Order became both shield and sword, guarding what it could and striking where it must. And in this relentless cycle, its members were remade. James and Lily Potter grew from idealistic newlyweds into hardened fighters. Frank and Alice Longbottom led missions with a bravery that inspired even the older veterans. Moody lost more pieces of himself to curses, but grew fiercer with each scar. And Sirius laughed less but fought harder. And each of them understood without speaking that the war would not end quickly, that victory, if it came at all, would come at a cost they could not yet imagine. And so the second year of the war bled into the third, and the Order of the Phoenix endured not because it was large or invincible, but because it refused to break. Because even as Voldemort's army grew and the Ministry faltered, the flame still burned in hidden rooms and safe houses, carried by people who knew they might die tomorrow, but chose to fight today. And in that choice lay the heart of the Order, a stubborn fire against the dark. The daily life of the Order during the First War did not look like banners and speeches. It looked like boots left drying by the fire at 3 in the morning, and maps spread across kitchen tables sticky with tea rings. It looked like passwords changing every few days so that friends had to rehearse them under their breath while walking down dark lanes. It looked like owl feathers caught in lamp chimneys and soot smudged on fingers that could not stop shaking even after the danger had passed. Because the work was not the sort that ends when a clock strikes. It kept breathing in the corners of rooms and under doorways and in the space behind the eyes when people tried to sleep and could not, and the Order learned to live with that constant hum as if it were a second heartbeat that would not quiet down. They kept odd hours, because the enemy kept none, sleeping in shifts wherever there was space on a couch or a floor, waking to the rattle of wards snapping like strings when someone appeared on the step with news. And in those moments they went from silence to full motion in a breath. Someone grabbed the medkit, someone checked the back door, someone stirred the fire into life and poured tea that would go cold untouched as messages spilled into the room faster than steam rose from the cups. And when the immediate crisis ended, they sat where they stood and let the quiet return slowly, as if it were afraid to approach. And then they began again, because there was always a second crisis behind the first, and a third behind the second waiting its turn. Safe houses were chosen for the way they vanished into ordinary streets. A narrow terrace with a cracked step that always snagged the heel. A farmhouse where the lane dipped and fog sat heavy at dusk. A cottage behind a hedge, so thick it swallowed sound. And each home grew a personality that reminded people they were still human while they did inhuman work. One had a grandfather clock that ran 5 minutes fast and saved lives twice because it pushed meetings forward just enough. Another had a cellar where someone had scrawled jokes on the wall to steady hands while mixing potions. Another had a garden gnome that bit everyone except Molly, and no one could explain it. And in each place there was a corner where a pair of boots waited for the next alarm, because alarms did not announce themselves nicely. Training did not happen on polished floors under bright lights. It happened in barns and attics and behind shop shutters. Spells practiced until arms ached and the air smelled of singed rope. Disarming charms drilled into habit so deeply that a wand flew from a hand before the mind had time to count the risk. Shield work repeated in low arcs until a whole line could raise protection in the same breath. And Moody drilled them without mercy, because mercy from him now would turn into mercy from a Death Eater later. and that kind killed. So he barked and paced and showed his scars with a grim humor that said, "You can survive worse than this and still move." And younger members who had once laughed too loudly learned to keep breath for the right moment and save jokes for when the door was locked again. Missions started as scraps of rumor and ended as footprints vanishing in rain. Someone heard a whisper in a pub from a mouth that shook with drink and fear. Someone saw a mark hanging too long above a field and knew it meant a second team was on the way. Someone caught a coded phrase slipped into a wireless broadcast that should have been about weather and trains, and by nightfall brooms were up and cloaks were down, and small groups were moving without attracting notice. Never enough bodies to make noise, always paired so that no one fell alone. And when they reached a door, the work broke into the familiar parts. One to lift wards, one to cut bindings, one to get people out before questions began. And on the better nights they left behind nothing but a charmed broom bristle in a crack to say, "We were here and you did not stop us." The cost was paid in small pieces most days, and in whole lives on others. A hex that left a hand nammed for a week. A fall that bruised ribs and pride. Then a night when someone did not return and a chair stayed empty for good, and grief burned strange in the order, soft and fierce at once. Molly knitting louder in the kitchen because the click of needles held the tears inside for a little while. Sirius pacing until the floorboards complained. Lily writing names on a slip of paper and folding it and unfolding it until the edges wore thin because the act of folding kept the names in order for a moment, and no one told anyone else how to mourn. They simply left a cup in the same place on the same table the next morning as if habit might call the lost back for one more breakfast. They did not only fight, they hid, and hiding is its own art. Forging papers for families who had never needed papers before, mixing glamours that changed hair and height and the slant of a jaw, teaching frightened parents how to hold a wand without broadcasting fear, showing children how to keep silent in a blanket fort while footsteps scraped the path outside, and then moving on when a lane felt too watched, because safety was never a place. Only a moment strung between other moments like beads that could break without warning. So suitcases lived half-packed on the tops of wardrobes, and every person in the circle knew which photo to grab first and which book to leave behind if the knock came wrong at midnight. Arguments grew from fatigue more often than from real disagreement. James and Moody snapping over whether to strike hard at a suspected cache or wait for proof. Remus asking for caution because he knew what it meant to be hunted and how quickly a misstep could cost a life. Lily insisting that certain families be moved now, not tomorrow, because tomorrow had a way of showing up without asking, and Dumbledore letting the voices rise and fall before he spoke, reminding them that the Order's strength was the way it held many minds together without breaking. And when the decision came, it was often a middle path no one loved but everyone could carry without dropping pieces in the road. Trust had to be built twice, once for the person and once for the secret they carried, because spies were real and close and sometimes wore a friend's smile. So countersigns were woven into ordinary talk. A remark about the weather that demanded a memory of a specific rain, a comment about tea that required the wrong blend as the right answer. And they practiced these measures until simple speech felt like stepping stones over dark water. And no one loved this constant testing, but everyone accepted it, because one careless word could undo weeks of moving pieces into place. And the Order had learned too many times that rebuilding costs more than building carefully the first time. In quieter hours, which were never truly quiet, they wrote letters they could not send yet, explained absences to relatives who did not know the truth, pretended to be ordinary at weddings and funerals that happened anyway because life insists on continuing, and sometimes they laughed hard enough to scare themselves because joy can arrive like a dare when it seems least possible. And they took the dare because refusing it would have meant letting the enemy win inside their own chests. And that was one field they did not intend to surrender, even for a night. There were victories bright enough to carry. Nights when a family reached a port key in time and vanished with tears on their faces and gratitude on their lips. Mornings when a Death Eater storehouse burned to the ground after the Order emptied it of stolen ones and stolen people. Afternoons when a captured comrade was pulled from a cell before questions started. And these moments stitched them together tighter than any oath, because shared survival writes a language only participants can read, a look across a crowded room that says we were there and we are still here, and that matters more than anyone else will ever understand. And yet the fear did not fade. It sharpened into the sense that an unseen map was being drawn by a hand. They could not stop. Roads converging toward a center they could not see. So they tried to read the shape of that map with the tools they had, counting attacks like beads, marking pins into battered atlases, tracing lines between names that kept appearing in reports. But the truth underneath all the patterns was simple and cold. Voldemort was still rising, and their work was to hold the line long enough for some chance they could not yet define to arrive. And holding the line is work that never ends when the other side does not tire of pushing. There were nights when the Order gathered in a kitchen that smelled of toast and burnt sugar, and someone's attempt at stew, and listened to Dumbledore describe dangers that had not yet happened, as if they were already moving through the room, and his calm made people breathe a little easier, even when the news was bad, because calm is contagious when it comes from a place that has seen storms and learned that panic never added a minute to anyone's life. And he thanked them in ways that felt like more than words. A hand on a shoulder, a memory recalled exactly. A look that said, "I see what you carried today, even if you never speak of it." And those small recognitions turned into fuel on mornings when exhaustion felt like a heavy cloak wet with rain. Some members balanced ordinary jobs with the shadow work, writing lesson plans, running shops, fixing roofs by daylight, and then vanishing into the night to meet at crossroads where hedges hid them from passing eyes. And it created a strange double life that warped time, days that felt like weeks and weeks that vanished in a blink. Birthdays celebrated with 2 candles stuck into a loaf of bread, anniversaries marked with a quick squeeze of the hand before a door closed, and through it all, they kept moving, because stopping was a luxury no one believed they had earned yet. They measured progress in the simplest metrics available. How many children reached new schools unharmed? How many brooms returned to their hooks? How many nights passed without a new mark scarring the sky? And on bad weeks the count went the wrong way, and people did not speak numbers out loud at all. They just scrubbed a table a little harder, or mended a cloak with more care. And on better weeks, someone brought cakes and they ate them with a guilt that faded when Dumbledore said, "Joy is not theft, it is resistance," and everyone nodded because they needed the sentence as much as the sugar. By the end of that year, their faces were leaner and their eyes older, but their resolve was not less. And if anyone had asked them how they managed, they would have answered that there was no secret. You packed a bag you never fully unpacked. You learned the shape of each other's breathing so you could tell who needed waking from a nightmare. You kept your wand where your hand could find it in the dark. You left notes for yourselves in jacket pockets because memory frays when it is always on edge. You showed up when the message came because the Order of the Phoenix was not a club or a uniform or a spell, it was a promise. And promises do not hold themselves. People hold, and that is what they did while the First War deepened and the storm gathered its full size just beyond the horizon they could see. The Order of the Phoenix had always known that resistance would draw blood. But as the war reached its height, the cost became unbearable in its frequency and weight, because what began as missions that ended with bruises and narrow escapes turned into a season when funerals outnumbered meals and names vanished from the circle with a regularity that carved grief into every breath. And yet they continued, because to stop would have meant allowing Voldemort to claim the world unchallenged, and that choice was no choice at all. The battles that defined these years were rarely neat or remembered in ballads. They happened on fog-soaked moors where curses lit the night brighter than lanterns, in back alleys where wards cracked like thunder, in lonely cottages whose gardens turned black under the mark of death, and the Order threw themselves into each fight, knowing that even when they won, the ground was scorched, and the survivors carried scars that no healer could mend. Yet they fought, because every duel delayed the tide, and every delay gave children one more dawn without terror. The Prewett brothers, Gideon and Fabian, became legends not because of ceremony, but because of the way they stood together against odds that would have broken whole squads, facing a dozen Death Eaters in a clash that spilled across fields and farmyards, their laughter rising even as their robes burned, their theirs flying in perfect tandem until at last the numbers overwhelmed them, and when news of their deaths reached the safe houses, the silence was heavier than any storm, because everyone knew that if men like the Prewetts could fall, then no one was untouchable. And yet the story of their stand became fuel as well, whispered like a charm to stiffen spines before the next mission. Marlene McKinnon's murder cut even deeper, because it was not just her but her whole family wiped out in a single night, a demonstration by Voldemort's forces that no one's bloodline, no one's hearth was safe, and the Order felt the echo of that massacre in every room where her laugh had once broken tension, in every plan where her sharp eyes had seen what others missed, and grief turned to anger that pushed them back into the field even when their bodies screamed for rest. Caradoc Dearborn disappeared during a mission that was never fully spoken of again, one moment present, the next swallowed by the dark without a trace, and his absence taught them that death was not the only loss, that vanishing left its own hollow that could not be filled because the mind gnawed forever on the question of whether he might still breathe somewhere, whether he might be suffering or waiting, and that uncertainty was in some ways crueler than death. The Order's duels with Death Eaters became running wars that left whole neighborhoods shaken, Moody losing more of himself to curses but snarling back with a ferocity that dared anyone to pity him, the Longbottoms leading charges that made others braver just by following, Lily and James Potter fighting with a fierceness sharpened by the knowledge that prophecy itself had named their son as central to the storm, though they never spoke of it openly in the crowded rooms, and Sirius Black, reckless and relentless, his wand a blur in the dark, his anger at his own family's allegiance to Voldemort turned into a weapon as sharp as steel. Each mission ended with someone not returning or someone carried back bleeding, and Molly Weasley's kitchen at safe houses became an infirmary more often than a place for meals, bandages laid out beside bread, potions simmering beside stews, and the mingling smells of healing and hunger became the scent of war for the Order. And through it all, Dumbledore remained the steady flame, listening, guiding, grieving in private, but refusing to let despair unmake the work they had begun. The pressure was unrelenting. Death Eaters targeting not just members but their families, owls intercepted, homes raided, children threatened, and so the Order lived with their wands, never out of reach, with charm layers around their homes so thick they hummed when you touched the air, and still they knew that no wall was perfect, no charm unbreakable, because Voldemort's reach seemed endless, his followers growing bolder by the month. But in spite of the losses and the fear, the Order endured, clinging to the belief that defiance itself was a victory, that every life saved, every attack blunted, every child hidden long enough to grow another inch was proof that Voldemort had not yet won. And though their nights were filled with funerals and their days with battles, they carried on, scarred but unbroken, because that was the promise they had made to each other when they first whispered the name of the Phoenix into the dark. The Order of the Phoenix staggered under the weight of its own bravery as the war pressed deeper, because after each funeral they rose again to fight. But the gaps in the circle grew wider and the empty chairs multiplied until it seemed the shadows were not only outside their doors, but sitting with them at every table. And still they endured because the alternative was silence, and silence was surrender. And no one who had chosen Dumbledore's side had the heart to bow their heads for long. Yet there was no disguising the truth that Voldemort was winning, not just in numbers but in fear, because even those who still resisted began to wonder whether the Order could last long enough to see the dawn. It was in this climate that prophecy stepped into the room like a new guest whose presence changed the air, because Sybil Trelawney, in a haze of vision, had spoken words that reached Dumbledore's ears, words that promised the fall of the Dark Lord would come at the hands of a child born as the 7th month died. And though only a fragment of that prophecy reached Voldemort through the ears of Severus Snape, it was enough to twist the entire war onto a new axis, because Voldemort believed in destiny only when it confirmed his own fear of death, and he decided that if a child might bring his end, then the child must be destroyed before the story could be written. For the Order, this knowledge was a burden they could not share openly. Only Dumbledore and a few trusted understood the weight of it, but its shadow-shaped decisions nonetheless. James and Lily Potter became central not only because of their courage and skill, but because their newborn son Harry carried the mark of prophecy on his very birth. And so they were hidden, placed under the Fidelius charm with Peter Pettigrew as their secret keeper choice that would haunt the Order forever. Because at the time it seemed clever, Pettigrew was small, unassuming, unlikely to be targeted, his loyalty to James unquestioned by those who called him friend. But in truth his loyalty had already shifted, cracked by fear, bent by Voldemort's promise of survival in exchange for betrayal. The days leading to the Potters' hiding were marked by tension that never eased. Sirius argued that he should be the keeper, that his devotion to James and Lily was stronger than anything. But Dumbledore and the Potters believed that too obvious, that Voldemort would suspect him first, and so the secret passed into Pettigrew's trembling hands. And history turned on that moment, because the Order had fought for years against masks and curses, and yet it was trust given to a friend that undid them in the end. While the Potters went into hiding, the Order fought on, missions continuing with the same urgency, families smuggled away, attacks blunted, spies hunted, but the sense of dread deepened, because Voldemort was not only striking harder, he was striking smarter. Information reached him too quickly, ambushes landed too perfectly, and whispers of a traitor spread even among the most loyal, though no one wanted to name the rat among them. And so suspicion ate at the edges of their unity, making every meeting colder, even as they swore again that they would not falter. Frank and Alice Longbottom stood with equal danger over their heads. Their son Neville, another child born at the end of July, and for a time it was unclear whom Voldemort would target. But his choice fell on Harry, perhaps because James and Lily had defied him 3 times already, perhaps because Pettigrew's treachery made them easier to find. And as the Order moved pieces around the board to guard both families, the Dark Lord moved faster, slipping through the cracks in their defenses and setting his path for Godric's Hollow. The Order could feel the noose tightening even if they did not yet know the details. They saw the increase in raids, the ferocity of curses cast at every clash, the desperation in Voldemort's push, and Dumbledore himself moved like a man who carried secrets too heavy to share, steady on the outside, but more withdrawn, because he knew the storm would break not in the fields where giants fought, but in a nursery where a child slept. And he prepared the Order, not with details but with the quiet instruction to endure whatever came next, to be ready for a world where the war ended suddenly, one way or another. Meetings grew quieter, the laughter that once patched the seams now rare, Molly's hands busier with bandages than with bread, Moody's paranoia sharper, as he checked every lock twice and then again. And in the midst of this unease, Pettigrew played his role, nodding, smiling, never drawing attention, hiding his fear beneath the mask of loyalty, and no one saw him slipping toward betrayal until it was too late, because no one wanted to believe that the smallest flame could be the one to burn the house from within. The Fidelius charm shimmered in place, hiding the Potters even from eyes that searched with love, and the Order allowed itself a breath of hope that perhaps this would work. Perhaps Voldemort would be denied long enough for something else to change the course. But hope has always been fragile in war. And in those nights, when the Order sat in cramped kitchens with mugs cooling untouched, they felt in their bones that the darkest hour had not yet come, and that when it did, it would change not only their circle but the entire world. The night of Halloween in Godric's Hollow became the fracture line of an era, because everything the Order had endured, every loss, every mission, every whispered meeting, all of it bent toward that single moment when Voldemort walked into a small cottage, believing he was about to end a prophecy, and instead ended himself, and none of the Order knew it as it happened. They only felt the tremor afterward, the sudden stillness in the air, as if a storm had cut itself short mid-strike, and then news began to move with the speed of rumor. First a whisper that something had gone wrong, then an owl flying wild into Dumbledore's office, then shouts in the streets that the Dark Lord was gone. For the Order, it was not joy at first, it was disbelief, because they had seen too much blood to trust any rumor. But as the hours passed, confirmation piled upon itself, Death Eaters scattering without command, the dark mark fading from the sky, survivors daring to step outside without spells on their lips, and then the final truth that Voldemort had gone to the Potters and had not come back, that James and Lily were dead, but their child lived, and the weight of it fell like stone and feather at the same time. Grief for the friends they had lost pressed against astonishment that the man who had called himself immortal had been undone by his own curse. The Order tried to gather, but found itself scattered, some rushing to Godric's Hollow, some holding the lines in case it was a trap, and Sirius Black rode with fire in his eyes because he knew exactly who had betrayed the Potters. But by the time he reached Pettigrew, the trap had been set the other way. An explosion in the street, 12 Muggles dead, Pettigrew gone, leaving only a finger, and Sirius dragged to Azkaban without trial, his laughter at the scene twisted by guards into proof of madness. And in a single night, the Order lost not only James and Lily, but also Sirius, one to death and one to prison, and the circle that had already been battered now broke apart entirely. The Ministry, eager to claim credit, declared victory as if it had been theirs, parading captured Death Eaters, filling the Prophet with headlines of triumph. But the Order knew better. They knew that victory had come, not from the Ministry's courage, but from the accident of a prophecy half fulfilled. And in the hollow that followed, they had no clear purpose, no leader to rally them daily, no war to fight, because the enemy had dissolved like smoke. And so they drifted into silence, some returning to jobs and families, some withdrawing into grief, some never recovering at all, and the name of the Order was spoken less and less until it became a memory rather than a movement. The Longbottoms, still fierce, continued the fight against stray Death Eaters who clung to their cause, but their bravery drew attention, and within a year they were struck down in cruelty that left them broken in mind, though not in body, and their tragedy was another wound carved into the Order's already scarred skin, because to see such steadfast fighters destroyed, not by death but by madness, was a reminder that the war did not end cleanly. It bled into the years after like poison that seeps even when the blade is gone. Moody stayed vigilant, never trusting the peace, living as if the war still raged just outside his window. Wards layered on wards, eyes flicking to every corner, and his paranoia, once a tool of survival, became a cage he built around himself. But in truth, he was not entirely wrong, because even in those years of supposed calm, the enemy was not dead. merely disembodied, and though the world chose not to see it, Dumbledore never forgot. He watched quietly, kept contacts alive, carried on in smaller ways, because he knew better than anyone that Voldemort had carved too deeply into the fabric of fear to vanish without trace. For the rest of the Order, the silent years were both relief and torment. Relief because children could sleep again. Torment because the price of that sleep had been the lives of too many friends. And in every kitchen where members once met, there was now only quiet. Photographs on mantles showing faces that would never grow older. Letters folded and refolded until the edges tore. And though life resumed in its ordinary shape, shops reopened, weddings took place, Quidditch matches filled the stadiums again. Beneath it all was the knowledge that they had stood in a storm that the rest of the world preferred to forget. And forgetting left them isolated with their memories. Some members withdrew entirely, choosing silence over reliving the war. Others carried on speaking of the lost as if they were still in the next room. But none of them could deny that the Order as it had been no longer existed. It was scattered ash across a battlefield that most of the world pretended had already grown grass over. And so, when Voldemort finally stirred again, years later, it caught many unprepared, but not Dumbledore and not the handful who had never allowed themselves to believe the shadow was gone for good. The years between wars are always dangerous because people grow complacent, and so the Order of the Phoenix passed into rumor and then into history, a name whispered only when old fighters met by chance in diagon alleys or dark pubs, raising a glass to absent friends, and in those moments the silence broke just enough for them to remember who they had been, and then it closed again, because saying it aloud too often made the absence heavier, and yet beneath the silence, the ember still smoldered, waiting for breath. The years that followed Voldemort's fall were remembered by most of the wizarding world as a season of relief, as if a long storm had finally broken and the sun could be trusted again. But for those who had carried the Order's burden, the peace was never simple, because every quiet street looked too still, every silence too deep, and while the rest of society rushed to rebuild shops and fill stadiums and celebrate children born into a world without the Dark Lord, the veterans of the Order carried their losses like hones in their pockets, heavy and constant reminders that war does not end just because the enemy is named dead. It lingers in memory, in habit, in the instinct to keep your wand within reach, even when you are only crossing the street to buy bread. Dumbledore alone never allowed himself the luxury of full relief, because he had studied Tom Riddle longer than anyone. He knew the depth of his hunger for immortality, and he doubted that a man who split his soul into fragments would vanish cleanly. So while he smiled at feasts and raised toasts at celebrations, he never ceased his quiet watch, following rumors of dark magic in remote corners, listening for patterns in disappearances that the Ministry dismissed as accidents, keeping alive the faint structure of contacts that had once been the Order, because he suspected that one day the Phoenix would have to rise again. For the others, life bent back toward ordinary shapes, but never fit exactly. Moody remained vigilant to the point of obsession, layering enchantments on his home until it bristled like a fortress, sleeping in brief snatches with one eye open because the war had burned out of him any belief that danger truly ended. And while some mocked him for paranoia, he lived long enough to prove that paranoia often saves more lives than hope, and so he stayed on the edge of society, half retired, half watchman, never at rest. Remus Lupin tried to carve out a quieter path, teaching when he could, vanishing into solitude when the moon demanded it, never free from the stigma that clung to his condition. But he carried the memory of the Order like a second skin, grateful to have survived yet hollowed by the knowledge that too many had not. And though he lived on, he did so with the restraint of someone who knew joy could be temporary, that peace could shatter without warning, For Molly and Arthur Weasley, the war's end meant raising their children in a world that seemed safer but still bore the marks of fear. Their home crowded with laughter, but also layered with protective charms. Because once you have lived through a time when homes burned and names disappeared, you never quite forget to guard the door, even in summer. And so their household became one of warmth and resilience. A place where the ideals of the Order quietly lived on through stories told at supper and lessons woven into the everyday, teaching their children to value courage, kindness, and defiance of cruelty. Sirius Black's fate was the cruelest of all. Locked away in Azkaban for crimes he had not committed, written off by most of the world as a traitor and a murderer. And while the Order no longer met to speak his name, those who had known him well carried unease in their hearts, because something about the story never fit, yet no one had the power to overturn it. And so the years passed with one of their brightest locked behind iron bars, his innocence unspoken, his laughter remembered only by the few who still believed it had once been real. The Longbottoms, broken in body and mind, remained in St. Mungo's, visited by a son who grew up learning his parents' names through stories told by others, and their tragedy became a permanent reminder of the war's cruelty, proof that survival could take forms worse than death. And among the Order, their absence was a wound that never healed, because Frank and Alice had been fierce and hopeful, and now they lived in silence, eyes wide, hands shaking, lost in memories no one else could touch. The Ministry proclaimed the war won and moved on quickly, eager to close the book, eager to forget the ways it had failed. But the Order could not forget, and even in their quieter lives, they remained bound by a sense of unfinished business, gathering occasionally in kitchens or pubs to raise glasses to the dead, their conversations wandering back again and again to missions survived, to names lost, and each toast was both celebration and lament, because the line between the two never quite set. Through the 80s and 90s, the wizarding world basked in the illusion of peace. Children filled Hogwarts without knowing how close the school had come to being swallowed by war. Shops thrived in Diagon Alley, Quidditch returned as the loudest noise most people heard, but beneath the surface strange reports surfaced from time to time. Dark magic stirring in Albania, travelers vanishing in forests, creatures fleeing places where no ordinary predator lived, and Dumbledore listened, filing each story away, watching with the patience of someone who knew that history rarely ends as neatly as people wish. And when at last whispers began that Death Eaters still met in secret, that not all had been captured or reformed, he was not surprised, only saddened that the world had chosen blindness. The Order did not exist as it once had, its meetings gone, its missions ended, but the spirit of it lived in its people, in the way Moody never stopped preparing, in the way the Weasleys raised children with quiet courage, in the way Lupin kept teaching whenever he was allowed, in the way Dumbledore kept his networks alive. And though the Phoenix had folded its wings, it had not burned out. It waited in silence, a spark in ash, and when the time came it would be ready to flare again. Because some fires are not extinguished, they only bide their time. And so the uneasy years passed, quieter than war, but never free of its memory. And though most of the world believed Voldemort was gone for good, the Order of the Phoenix carried on as scattered embers, waiting for the moment when the air would stir and the shadow would lengthen once more. When Voldemort returned to full strength in the graveyard at Little Hangleton, the wider wizarding world did not believe it, or perhaps did not want to, because denial is easier than fear. But Dumbledore felt the truth immediately, his scarred hands tightening on the arms of his chair as the echoes of that night reached him through Harry Potter's words. And he did not wait for ministry approval or public confirmation. He began at once to summon the old circle, to write letters that would burn after reading, to send messages through trusted channels, because he knew what the rest of the world would not admit. The war had begun again, and the Phoenix had to rise from its ashes. The old members answered quickly, Moody appearing as though he had never left the field, Remus Lupin setting aside his solitude to take his place again, Arthur and Molly Weasley agreeing without hesitation even as they worried for the children who would inevitably be pulled into danger, and others who had survived the First War stepped forward with the weariness of veterans, but the resolve of people who understood that they could not leave the fight to the young. And into this circle Dumbledore folded new faces as well, because the world had changed since the last war, and the Order had to change with it. Nymphadora Tonks came first, young and bright and eager, her metamorph Magus talents making her invaluable in a world where disguise and infiltration mattered. And though her clumsiness in ordinary tasks made her the subject of affectionate jokes, her courage in the field silenced doubt quickly, and she brought with her a sense of renewal, proof that the Order was not only memory, but also future, a bridge between the generation that had suffered and the one that would carry the fight forward. Kingsley Shacklebolt joined as well, calm and precise, already positioned inside the Ministry as an aura of skill and reputation. And his presence gave the Order an anchor within the very institution that now refused to recognize Voldemort's return, because Cornelius Fudge had chosen denial, choosing to treat Harry and Dumbledore as liars, rather than admit that darkness had risen again. And this denial meant the Order had to work in shadows once more, protecting the world in secret, even from the leaders who should have been standing with them. The first tasks of the Reformed Order were urgent and dangerous, securing allies before Voldemort could, reaching out to old contacts, convincing hesitant witches and wizards that the threat was real, even when the Ministry declared otherwise, and guarding Harry Potter himself, because Dumbledore knew that the boy remained central to Voldemort's plans, and so the Order moved quietly, accompanying him from Privet Drive, ensuring that his journeys to Hogwarts were protected, watching the horizon for Death Eaters who had already begun to slip back into their masks. The headquarters of this new order was set at number 12, Grimmauld Place, an old black family house thick with dust and bitterness, its walls whispering with the echoes of dark magic, and Sirius, now escaped from Azkaban, offered it as their base, though it was both gift and burden because the house carried the weight of his childhood. Every hallway lined with portraits of ancestors who had chosen the Dark Lord's side. Every corner heavy with memories of a family he had rejected, and though he gave it gladly to the Order, it also caged him, keeping him bound in the very place he had once fled, a confinement that wore on him as the months passed. In Grimmauld Place, the old and the new Order sat side by side, Molly bustling in the kitchen, Tonks tripping over umbrellas, Moody muttering about security, Kingsley slipping in and out with news from the Ministry, Lupin bringing calm where tempers frayed, Sirius pacing restlessly from room to room, and Dumbledore appearing only when necessary, always with the air of a man carrying secrets he could not yet share. And in these rooms plans were drawn, missions assigned, protections layered, and though the world outside pretended peace, within these walls the war was spoken of with the gravity of certainty. The new members brought energy, but also questions, because the old scars of the First War ran deep. Moody's suspicion made him slow to trust. Molly's protectiveness sometimes clashed with Sirius's recklessness. Lupin's quiet sadness weighed heavily on nights when laughter was thin. But these tensions did not break the Order. They gave it shape, reminded everyone that this was not an army bound by ranks, but a family bound by choice. And families argue, families stumble, but families also endure. And that was the essence of the Phoenix. Even as the Order worked, the Ministry turned against them, spreading stories that Harry was unstable, that Dumbledore sought power, that the Order was nothing more than a band of eccentrics stirring panic. And these lies made their work harder, because every ally they sought had to be convinced against the grain of official news. But in another way, the smear campaign strengthened their resolve, because they had lived through this before. They remembered the First War, when suspicion and corruption had blinded the ministry, and they knew better than to wait for approval that would never come until it was too late. The Order's early missions in this Second War included guarding prophecies stored in the Department of Mysteries, tracking the movements of known Death Eaters who had escaped justice, and trying to protect those families most at risk. And though some missions succeeded, others ended in blood, because Voldemort's followers had returned with the same cruelty as before, and the cycle of fear began again. Shops attacked, names disappearing, the mark burning in the sky, and the Order, smaller in number than the enemy, did what it always had. It endured, it resisted, it carried the flame. The phoenix had risen from ash, its wings scarred but strong, and though the world might not yet see the fire, those who fought in shadow knew it was burning, knew that the Second War had already begun, and that the Order of the Phoenix would once again be the line between darkness and those who could not defend themselves. Number 12, Grimmauld Place, became the heart of the Order, but it was a heart that beat unevenly, its rhythm shaped by secrets in the walls and ghosts in the curtains, because the house had been born of a family that chose darkness long before Voldemort's rise, and every room whispered with that history. Black family portraits sneering at those who walked past, house elf heads mounted as trophies along the staircase, dust clinging so thick that even magic seemed to hesitate before sweeping it away. And yet in those same walls, a new fight was planned, a war room carved out of a place that had once stood for the very values they opposed. And this irony hung heavy, but also made the act of resistance sharper, because every plan spoken there was a rejection of the house's past. Sirius Black, restless and wild, paced its halls like a caged animal, because though he had offered the house freely, he could not escape its weight. Every corner pressed on him with memories of a family that had disowned him. Every sneer from his mother's portrait clawed at old wounds, and while the others could leave for missions, for work, for errands, Sirius remained trapped, wanted by the ministry, hunted by his old enemies, unable to step into the open air without risking Azkaban again. And his frustration simmered into recklessness, into longing for action that never came, into arguments that tore at his friendships, and at times even at Harry, because confinement is its own kind of prison, and Grimmauld Place was chains disguised as shelter. Molly Weasley moved through the rooms with a different energy, her hands always busy, cooking, cleaning, tidying, not because the house demanded it, but because her heart did. Because in work she found control, and in feeding others she kept despair at bay. Yet even her warmth carried sharp edges here, her protectiveness over her children and Harry clashing, often with Sirius's hunger to treat Harry as an equal, as a soldier ready for the field, and their arguments filled the house with a tension that meals could not soften, because beneath the shouting lived a truth neither could erase, that the war would claim the young no matter how fiercely one tried to shield them or how recklessly another tried to throw them into the fire. Remus Lupin brought quiet steadiness, slipping into the house between assignments, his presence like a calm tide that soothed some of the storms. Yet he too carried the strain of poverty and stigma, his robes worn, his body tired, his spirit stretched thin by years of rejection, but he gave what he could, teaching when time allowed, offering Harry the kind of guidance Sirius could not, and his voice became a thread that held the fraying fabric of Grimmauld Place together. When tempers ran too high, though even he could not stitch all the cracks, Snape entered less often, his dark robes and colder eyes filling the kitchen with suspicion each time he arrived. And though Dumbledore insisted his presence was necessary, that his double role as spy within Voldemort's circle was invaluable. Few inside trusted him, Sirius least of all, their old hatred simmering into open contempt. Sharp words exchanged that turned meetings into battlegrounds of their own. And the others watched in silence, caught between needing Snape's information and doubting the man who delivered it. And this mistrust became another shadow in a house already filled with them. Harry's arrival changed the energy completely, because the house was no longer just a headquarters but also a home for him during that summer. And with him came both light and weight. Light because his presence drew laughter from Ron and Hermione, filled halls with the noise of youth that had been missing. But weight because the boy carried the burden of prophecy and of Voldemort's obsession, and every member of the Order knew that he was not simply another child, but the axis on which the war turned. And they argued over how much to tell him, how much to shield him, how much to prepare him, and each decision carved deeper divides between Sirius, Molly, and the rest. The meetings themselves were long and often bitter. Papers spread across the kitchen table, maps marked with pins and ink, reports delivered in clipped tones, Moody growling about constant vigilance, Kingsley laying out intelligence from the Ministry, Tonks cheerful even when she stumbled over her own feet, her brightness a welcome relief, and Dumbledore appearing rarely, but when he did his words cut through the noise with the authority of someone who carried more knowledge than he could share, his presence both a reassurance and a reminder that the stakes were higher than even the bravest dared to imagine. The younger Weasleys, Hermione and Harry strained against the boundaries drawn around them, pressing ears to doors, catching fragments of conversations, piecing together truths that adults thought hidden, and their impatience mirrored the frustration of Sirius, who insisted that the children had a right to know, because they were already part of the story, whether the Order admitted it or not. And each argument on this subject left the house ringing with voices until silence returned like a slammed door, heavier and sharper than before. Life inside Grimmauld Place was not all quarrels. It was also nights when laughter echoed through the halls, despite everything. Fred and George turning every object into a joke, Tonks shifting her hair into ridiculous shades to make Ginny laugh, Molly's meals bringing warmth that softened tempers, Lupin's calm telling stories of Hogwarts days that made even Sirius smile for a moment, and Harry finding in those rooms a family of sorts, imperfect, fractured, but bound by a love for him that no curse could break. And these moments of peace were as much resistance as the missions outside, proof that Voldemort could not extinguish joy entirely. Still, the house carried constant tension, its walls pressing inward with the knowledge that outside Voldemort was moving, gathering followers, infiltrating power, and the Order's work was urgent but unseen. Victories small and uncelebrated, losses sharp and personal, and inside Number 12, the air was thick with the knowledge that each person there was risking everything, that every laugh might be the last, and that the war was not a story told at the edges of the world, but a weight pressing down on their own roof beam. And so Grimmauld Place became more than a headquarters. It became a crucible where old wounds, new hopes, bitter arguments, and fragile joys mixed together. And though it sometimes threatened to break those within, it also forged them harder, binding them into something that could endure the long shadow of Voldemort's return. Because the Phoenix is not born in calm skies, it is born in fire and ash. And the Order's fire burned hottest in the dark corners of that ancient house, where defiance was whispered, shouted, and lived. Outside the suffocating walls of Grimmauld Place, the Order of the Phoenix worked in shadows again, their missions unfolding in the quiet corners of the wizarding world, where the Ministry refused to look, because Cornelius Fudge had chosen to turn his back on truth, building instead a wall of denial so high that those who tried to peer over it were mocked as hysterics or liars. And this left the Order with two wars to fight at once, one against Voldemort's gathering army and one against the complacency of a government that preferred comfortable ignorance to dangerous reality. They moved quietly through villages where attacks had begun again, their eyes scanning for the dark mark that sometimes hung above rooftops before fading as if to taunt those who arrived too late. And they gathered the terrified survivors into their arms, casting protective charms, relocating families to safer houses layered with wards that hummed like taut strings in the air. And though the prophet insisted that no such attacks were happening, the order saw the bodies, the scorch marks, the ruins, and their patience for the ministry's lies grew thinner with every mission. Recruitment became as dangerous as battle, because every potential ally had to be approached carefully. No owl could be trusted, no casual meeting in Diagon Alley could be safe. So contacts were built in pubs where shadows hid expressions, in back rooms of shops where curtains muffled sound, and always with countersigns and proof, because spies slipped easily into circles where fear was high and desperation higher, and the order had already lived through betrayal once and would not forget that lesson. So they built trust slowly, carefully, and when someone finally agreed to stand with them, it was celebrated not with cheers, but with a solemn nod, because each new name carried both hope and the weight of another life at risk. Kingsley Shacklebolt's position within the Aura office became invaluable. He filtered information to the Order with the calm precision of a man who could not afford even a flicker of hesitation. Reports of Death Eaters slipping through trials, of dark artifacts appearing in shops that were supposed to be monitored, of laws being twisted subtly in ways that gave cover to Voldemort's sympathizers, and Kingsley carried this intelligence into Grimmauld Place, where plans were drawn around kitchen tables, strategies shaped not only against the enemy outside, but against the blindness of the very institution meant to keep order. Tonks threw herself into missions with an enthusiasm that lifted others, her ability to change appearance making her a phantom in the field, slipping past guards, gathering intelligence, smuggling endangered Muggle-born families through checkpoints. The ministry swore did not exist, and though her clumsiness sometimes turned serious operations into near disasters, her courage and quick thinking always carried her through, and she became not just a fighter, but a symbol of what the new generation brought to the Order, a reminder that the Phoenix did not only burn with old flame, but sparked with new fire. Missions stretched members thin, Moody drilling younger recruits with his usual severity before sending them into nights where curses lit the sky. Arthur Weasley balancing his ministry job with Order duties, slipping through offices where Fudge's paranoia painted Dumbledore as a usurper, collecting scraps of evidence that the government itself was becoming compromised, and Molly managing the invisible labor that kept the group alive, feeding fighters who stumbled in half-conscious, patching robes, mending morale, her presence as necessary as any duel in an alleyway, and though she worried constantly about the danger to her children, she gave her loyalty again and again, because she understood the war was no longer something you could keep the young from. It was something you had to face together. The smear campaign against Harry and Dumbledore grew harsher with each passing week, the prophet printing stories that painted them as unstable, attention-seeking, dangerous, and this made the Order's work harder because every ally had to wade through propaganda before they could believe the truth. But the Order knew that lies crumble in the face of reality, and they held their ground quietly, telling the truth where they could, protecting those who needed it, waiting for the moment when Voldemort would act openly enough that no headline could bury the evidence. Every mission returned to the same truth. They were outnumbered and outmatched, but they carried something Voldemort's army never could, a loyalty not bound by fear, a determination that was not coerced but chosen, and this gave them strength, even in exhaustion, even in doubt, and though they lost battles, though they returned with bodies that could not be saved, the fact that they continued at all was defiance, and defiance was the very heart of the Phoenix. The Ministry's smear campaign could not erase the truth forever, and the Order knew it, So they endured, carrying out mission after mission in silence, saving who they could, preparing for the day when Voldemort would step out of the shadows fully, and when that day came, the world would finally see what they had known all along, that the Dark Lord had risen again, and that the Order of the Phoenix had never stopped. Inside number 12, the war felt different than it did in the fields and alleys, because here, it was not curses flashing or giants marching, but the slow weight of confinement and the fraying of tempers. The Order met around the same scarred kitchen table night after night, parchment spread, mugs left half empty, the air thick with arguments that never fully ended, and the house itself seemed to listen with disapproval, portraits muttering, staircases groaning, creature lurking, and whispering insults under his breath. And in that atmosphere, the work of resistance was as much about holding one another together as it was about fighting the enemy outside. Sirius bore the confinement worst of all, his freedom only recently regained after years in Azkaban, and now stolen again by the need for secrecy. He was a man built for action, for duels, for reckless charges into danger, and Grimmauld Place caged him in memories he despised. Every inch of the house, a reminder of the family that had turned its back on him. Every sneer from his mother's portrait, an echo of a childhood spent fighting against chains he thought he had broken. And now those chains felt heavier than ever, and he lashed out in arguments, in reckless suggestions, in desperate attempts to draw Harry closer, as if in the boy he could reclaim both friendship and freedom. And though Harry loved him for it, the rest of the Order saw the danger in his restlessness. Molly Weasley clashed with him most, her protectiveness clashing against his recklessness. She wanted Harry shielded, Sirius wanted him treated as a soldier, and their voices rose so often that others grew used to the sound of their quarrels echoing through the house. Yet beneath the shouting lay a common truth. Both cared fiercely for the same boy, both carried grief that had hollowed them. Molly mourning the war already, even as she cooked to keep her family alive. Sirius mourning the years lost in Azkaban, and the friends taken from him, and grief given no outlet always finds its way into arguments. Remus Lupin was often the bridge, quiet and steady, arriving between assignments to sit at the table with a calm that soothed tempers, his words careful, his presence grounding. And though he carried his own burdens of poverty, stigma, and loneliness, he gave what he could, mediating when Sirius's recklessness burned too hot, reminding Molly of the need for preparation as well as protection, and offering Harry the kind of steady affection he lacked elsewhere. And in many ways, Lupin became the quiet spine of the Order inside the house, even if his role was less visible in the field. Snape's visits turned the house colder. His presence never welcome, his information necessary, but his demeanor sharp as ever. He traded reports with Dumbledore in clipped tones, ignored questions from others, and seemed to take pleasure in needling Sirius, their animosity sparking like flint each time they shared the same room. And though Dumbledore assured them all that Snape's loyalty lay where it must, doubt never left the kitchen when he departed, his footsteps echoing long after he was gone, leaving behind an air of mistrust that none could fully dispel. The house carried small routines that kept the Order from unraveling. Molly's meals that filled the table no matter how tense the air. Tonks bringing laughter with clumsy crashes that broke through silence. Moody growling about vigilance even in moments of supposed rest. Kingsley slipping in with reports from the Ministry delivered with calm precision. And Arthur arriving weary from days of smiling through Fudge's lies at work. And in these rhythms they found a fragile balance, not peace exactly, but function enough to keep the fire burning in the hearth and the fight alive in their hearts. For the younger ones who stayed there, Harry, Ron, Hermione, Ginny, the house was both prison and sanctuary, its walls filled with secrets they were desperate to uncover. its rooms alive with whispers of a war they were told was too dangerous for their ears, and they strained against the boundaries placed around them, pressing ears to doors, piecing together fragments, arguing for inclusion. And each argument reminded the older order members of the line they had to walk between protecting children and preparing the fighters they would inevitably become. And this tension wound through every day like a thread pulled too tight. Grimmauld Place was not only a headquarters but a crucible, its air heavy with memory and argument, with loyalty and mistrust, with grief and stubborn hope. And though at times it seemed the house itself might crack under the strain, it held, because the people within it held, clinging to one another through tempers and fears, because the phoenix burns hottest when pressed into darkness, and the Order's fire lived on inside those walls, even when its light was dimmed by the weight of war. The summer's tension broke at last, not in the walls of Grimmauld Place, but in the cold echoing halls of the Department of Mysteries, because Voldemort knew that hope could be twisted into a trap, and he used Harry's heart as the bait, sending visions that led him to believe Sirius was captive and in need of rescue, and the boy who carried the prophecy ran into danger with friends at his side, their courage greater than their years, and when word of this reached the Order, it was already too late to prevent, only to follow, to throw themselves once more into fire in the hope that the young would not burn. The Order arrived in the black marble corridors of the Ministry in the dead of night, bursting into a battle that had already begun. Death Eaters surrounding children who fought with desperation and instinct, the air thick with the crackle of spells, glass shattering in the hall of prophecy as spheres fell and broke like rain, whispers of futures lost spilling into the floor, and into this chaos came Lupin, Tonks, Moody, Kingsley, and Sirius, their wands flashing, their voices cutting through the tumult, shields raised, curses returned, the line between child and soldier erased in an instant by necessity. The fighting was brutal, not the quick duels of alleys, but a sustained clash that moved from chamber to chamber, the Death Eaters pressing hard to seize the prophecy, the Order pushing back with every ounce of skill honed over 2 wars, Tonks weaving between curses with daring speed, Kingsley's spells landing with measured precision, Moody roaring warnings even as his magical eyes spun wildly, Lupin steady, protecting Harry with the same determination he had once shown James, and Sirius laughing with wild joy at the chance to fight again after years of imprisonment and confinement. His wand a blur of fire that lit the dark. For a moment it seemed the Order might turn the tide, the Death Eaters driven back, the children rallied, hope flickering in the smoke. But battles turn on moments too small to see until they have already passed, and in the Chamber of the Veil Sirius faced his cousin Bellatrix. Laughter against laughter, curse against curse, their duel a storm of family hatred sharpened by years of betrayal, and then a flash of red, a step too close to the arch that whispered like a sigh, and Sirius fell backward through it, his grin still on his face as the veil swallowed him without a sound. The battle did not pause for grief, but grief struck all the same. Harry's scream cutting through the chamber as Lupin held him back, the Order pressing harder in fury, their spells striking with renewed force. But the veil did not give back what it had taken, and when at last reinforcements arrived, and Voldemort himself was forced into the open, revealed before the eyes of the Ministry at last, it was too late for Sirius, and the prophecy sphere that had lured them all lay shattered among shards of glass, its words lost except in memory. The Order retreated, with their wounded, carrying Tonks limp but alive, Moody bleeding but unbroken, Harry silent in shock, and the loss of Sirius hung heavier than any victory gained that night, because though the world would finally believe that Voldemort had returned, though the Ministry could no longer deny what its own eyes had seen, the price had been the life of a man who had already lost too much, a man who had given his house, his name, his heart to the cause, and who had found his end in silence behind a veil no one understood. Back at Grimmauld Place, the house itself seemed to mourn, the portrait of his mother shrieking with renewed fury, the walls colder than ever, Creature muttering with a bitterness that carried guilt as well as hate, and the Order sat at the table with heavy eyes, the victory of revelation, to the world soured by the absence of the friend who should have been there to see it. And though they knew that his death had turned the tide of belief, they also knew that belief would not bring him back, and the phoenix burned that night with more ash than flame. The summer, after the Department of Mysteries, did not feel like relief, though the Ministry finally admitted the truth, because the Order had waited for years for the wider world to see what they had known all along. Yet when the admission came, it arrived too late, too blood-stained, and for those who had fought in the black corridors that night, the cost was carved too deep to celebrate. Sirius was gone, and with him went not only a fighter, but a friend who had been flame and laughter in the darkest corners of their circle. And the emptiness of Grimmauld Place became unbearable, its walls groaning with absence, its halls echoing with the sound of someone who would never again pace them restlessly. Dumbledore carried the weight of it, most heavily though he showed it least, because every death returned to his shoulders, whether or not his hand had guided the choice, and Sirius had been both his responsibility and his regret. But he did not stop moving. He could not, for now. The Ministry had at last recognized Voldemort's return, and that meant the Order had to expand, to prepare openly for the war that had begun in truth. And while others staggered under grief, he began again to draw maps, to send messages, to call new allies to the fire. The old members endured as they always had, Lupin burying his sorrow in quiet work, Tonks throwing herself more recklessly into missions as if to balance her loss, with fury, Moody pacing even more fiercely as if vigilance itself could bring Sirius back, Molly mourning as if he had been another of her own, Arthur doubling his hours to keep watch at the Ministry where corruption still lingered even after Fudge's fall, and Kingsley steady as stone, carrying more responsibility as the Aura office shifted under new leadership, his calm voice and precise movements a counterweight to the turbulence around him. Harry's grief poured into the air of the house and of the school alike, because the boy carried Sirius not just as a godfather, but as the closest link to the parents he had lost, and the Order watched helplessly as he stumbled through anger and silence, unable to lighten his burden, but resolved more fiercely than ever to protect him. For his survival now mattered not only as prophecy, but as the heart of their own hope, the living proof that Voldemort could be resisted even when victory felt far. The Order expanded quickly after the Ministry's recognition, new recruits joining with a mixture of fear and determination, witches and wizards who had once dismissed the warnings, now stepping forward because denial was no longer possible. And the old guard taught them the habits of survival, passwords and countersigns, the way to move quickly without notice, the way to sleep in bursts and still wake ready to fight. And though the newcomers' eyes were bright with nerves, they carried the same fire, because no one chose the Order for glory. They chose it because the alternative was surrender. The Ministry under new command sought to repair its failures, but bureaucracy moved slower than fear, and Death Eaters were already pressing harder, emboldened by their leader's open return, and the Order found itself stretched thin again, missions multiplying, risks rising, the same rhythm of exhaustion and urgency that had defined the First War returning like a memory too vivid to ignore, and yet the veterans carried it without flinching, because they had lived it once and knew they could live it again, though each carried the secret dread that living it again might this time mean dying in it. Grimmauld Place remained headquarters, though its silence grew heavier, without Sirius, and Molly tried to soften it with warmth, Tonks with humor, but the portrait of Wahlburger Black shrieked louder than ever. creature muttered with venom that no charm could silence, and the younger members who passed through the house felt its chill even more keenly, for they had known Sirius as laughter and now found only echoes, and it became another burden to carry, another reminder that war does not only kill on battlefields, but also in the hearts of homes. Still, the Order endured, for endurance was its very nature, and as Voldemort moved openly now, recruiting giants, spreading fear, testing the Ministry's defenses, the Phoenix burned brighter, scarred but alive, ready again to stand between darkness and those who could not, and the losses of the past became not weights to drag them down, but fuel to drive them forward. Each absence turned into a vow that no more names would be lost without resistance. The year after Sirius's death settled over the Order like a long winter, because though the Ministry could no longer deny that Voldemort had returned, the acknowledgement of truth did not bring safety. It only sharpened the danger, and every member of the Order knew that the enemy would now move with greater confidence, no longer hiding in shadows, but walking openly through them, gathering strength, spreading fear, bending the institutions of power until they groaned under the weight, and so the Phoenix burned again, not with triumph, but with grim determination, because the Second War was no longer a whispered secret, it was the air itself. The Order worked harder than ever to shield those most at risk. Muggle-born families guided into safe houses, names erased from records, children moved under heavy wards to homes they had never seen. And these missions carried the same exhaustion as the First War, but with a sharper edge, because this time Voldemort knew exactly who stood against him, and he pressed them harder, targeting not only the vulnerable but also the protectors, striking at oars, at Ministry officials who dared speak Dumbledore's name with respect, at anyone rumored to have ties to the Order, and so secrecy became armor again, passwords changing weekly, messages layered with spells that burned if intercepted, countersigns tested 3 times before a door was opened. Lupin carried on in the field, his calm and his skill essential in missions that required both diplomacy and ferocity. But he carried new burdens now, his love for Tonks shadowed by his fear that his condition made him unworthy, that bringing her into his life would only endanger her further, and the Order watched him wrestle with himself, his face weary, his voice quiet, and they respected his restraint even as they longed for him to accept that love itself could be resistance. Because in a world where fear sought to hollow out every heart, choosing joy was as defiant as any duel. Tonks herself fought with unwavering loyalty, her hair shifting colors that betrayed her mood, her clumsiness at odds with her courage. And though she returned from missions with bruises and exhaustion, she never faltered. Yet the weight of Lupin's distance pressed on her, dimming her brightness, and those in the Order who noticed exchanged glances heavy with worry, because morale mattered as much as numbers, and the loss of joy in one fighter could ripple through them all, reminding them that war wages not only on battlefields but in the silence between two people who cannot find their way to each other. The Weasleys continued to give more than they could afford, Arthur still working in the Ministry under constant risk, Molly shouldering the weight of worry for every child scattered across missions and school, Fred and George bursting with inventions that sometimes lighten the air and sometimes turn serious work into chaos, but always reminded others that laughter had not been extinguished. Ron and Ginny still young, but already drawn into the heart of the struggle through their ties to Harry, and Bill and Charlie fighting their own battles abroad, yet tied by loyalty to the family flame, and in their unity the Order found strength, proof that love itself could defy the darkness. Moody grew harsher, his eyes spinning with more suspicion than ever, his barked orders sharp enough to cut, his insistence on constant vigilance wearing on the nerves of those around him. Yet no one dismissed him, because they knew he was right. The enemy could be anywhere, and vigilance had saved them before, and though his gruffness grated, it also anchored them, because his scars told the truth that few wanted to speak aloud. that survival was not neat, it was jagged and relentless, and it required the will to stay alert even when exhaustion begged for rest. Kingsley balanced his role with quiet mastery, moving through the ministry like a shadow, gathering intelligence, protecting allies, feeding the Order with information that often made the difference between survival and disaster. And though his calm made him seem untouched, those who knew him best saw the toll it took, the lines deepening on his face, the weariness hidden under steady words, yet he carried on without complaint. His presence a reminder that discipline and patience were weapons as sharp as any spell. Harry's grief over Sirius did not fade. It hardened into resolve, and the Order watched him from a distance, guarding him even when he did not know it, following silently in the shadows, ensuring his path to school was safe, ensuring that the boy who had once been their symbol of survival remained alive, because they knew Voldemort's eyes were fixed on him still. And in Harry they saw both the risk and the hope of the future, and their protection of him was not only duty, it was belief that the prophecy could bend toward life instead of death, if only the boy lived long enough to see it through. The war's second year grew darker with each month, attacks spreading, disappearances multiplying, and the Order stretched thin, their meetings heavy with lists of the dead and the missing, their missions blurring together into a rhythm of exhaustion. Yet they did not falter, because to falter would be to let Voldemort claim not just lives but the meaning of lives. And they refused him that, clinging to each other, to duty, to the small moments of laughter that still sparked around the kitchen table. Because those sparks were the reason they fought, the proof that the world was still worth saving. And so the Order endured, scarred, weary, grieving, yet alive, its flame carried in hands that trembled but never dropped the torch. And though the shadow grew longer, they stood together in defiance, because they had already learned once that darkness does not end by itself. It ends only when those who refuse to bow stand and keep standing, no matter the cost. The Order had always known that Harry Potter's safety was more than a duty. It was the axis of the war, and as Voldemort's power spread openly across the wizarding world, the risk of leaving him at Privet Drive grew unbearable. The protective enchantments that had lingered from his mother's sacrifice would break when he came of age, and Dumbledore had already gone to his rest. So the Order gathered again in hushed voices around the table at Grimmauld Place to plan a mission that none of them wanted, but all of them knew was necessary: the extraction of Harry from the only house that had ever bound him safely. And though their faces were tired and their eyes shadowed, each one volunteered without hesitation, because they understood that guarding Harry meant guarding the one chance the world still had. The plan was audacious in its simplicity and its danger. 7 porters flying into the night, 6 transformed by Polyjuice to draw fire away from the real one, each paired with a protector, and the risk of such magic was enormous, because once in the air confusion would reign, curses would fly, and Voldemort himself would surely come. Yet the Order accepted it, because to do less would be to leave Harry vulnerable, and no one in that room could stomach that thought. On the night of the mission, the air was heavy with anticipation, Harry drinking the bitter potion, watching as friends and allies shifted into his likeness, their features bending, their hair darkening, their glasses settling on unfamiliar noses, and the sight was both absurd and terrifying. A small army of Harrys adjusting robes and glasses, each aware that the choice might cost them their lives, and yet no one faltered, because loyalty has no disguise. It shows itself in action, and each of them chose to become a target for the sake of one boy. The flight began with a roar of brooms and the thrum of thestral wings, the sky above England cut by streaks of movement, the wind whipping hard as pairs broke away into the night, each hoping to lose pursuers in different directions, and for a heartbeat the plan seemed to work. The air filled only with the rush of flight, the lights of villages blinking far below. But then the ambush came, Death Eaters erupting from clouds with curses that lit the night like a storm. Green and red bolts streaking past, broom bristles singed the strolls, shrieking as spells tore through the air, and the Order's mission dissolved into chaos. Spells crackled in every direction, Moody barking orders, Kingsley steady at his side, Tonks twisting through dives to shield her partner, Hagrid's vast form clinging to Sirius's motorbike with Harry clutched in the sidecar. The machine roaring against gravity as curses slammed around them, and in the confusion, the line between victory and disaster blurred with each breath, because the Death Eaters had expected them. Voldemort himself rose into the night with wand raised, and for the first time Harry faced him not in dream or vision, but in the open sky, the Dark Lord's power blazing against the stars. The Order fought with everything they had, dodging, weaving, countering, but the cost came swift. Hedwig struck down, her snowy body tumbling into the dark, a symbol of Harry's childhood gone in an instant, and worse followed. Moody hit in the chaos, falling, his fierce voice silenced, his body never recovered, and the shock of his loss rippled through the Order, even as they flew, because he had been their constant, their scarred anchor, and to lose him in mid-air felt like losing vigilance itself, and yet they could not stop, not to mourn, not to gather, only to fly harder, faster, to survive. Hagrid's motorbike blazed with fire, Harry clinging to the sidecar, Voldemort closing in, curses striking sparks off the shield, and for a moment it seemed the end would come there in the open air, but fate twisted. Harry's wand acting of its own accord, Voldemort's borrowed power clashing with something deeper. And the boy lived again while the Order, scattered and battered, limped toward the burrow one by one, arriving with wounds and grief, counting who had returned and who had not. And when the tally was finished, the silence told the truth. Mad-Eye Moody was gone. The burrow filled with both relief and sorrow, embraces for the living, tears for the dead, and the Order sat in exhausted grief around another table, their numbers fewer, their hearts heavier, yet still bound by the same duty, because Harry had been saved, and that meant the mission had succeeded, even at terrible cost, and this truth became both comfort and burden, for they knew the war would demand more of them still. The strain on the Order deepened after that night, the loss of Moody cutting their strength not only in numbers but in spirit, for he had been the embodiment of constant vigilance, and without him, their watch felt more fragile, their nights longer, their risks sharper, but they carried on, because that is what the Order had always done, carrying loss like a second skin and still moving forward, still choosing defiance, still lighting the fire again even when it burned their hands. The fall of the Ministry came not with a bang that split the world in half, but with a slow tightening that left little room to breathe. One decree after another, stripping freedoms, one office after another filled with faces loyal to Voldemort, and by the time the dark mark rose over the institution, meant to guard law and order, the capture was complete. The Ministry no longer a government, but a weapon, and in that moment, the Order of the Phoenix became not only a resistance, but an outlaw band. Hunted openly, their names whispered with threats, their homes no longer safe, their movements traced by spies and informants, and the war entered its darkest season. Members who had once walked freely through Diagon Alley now moved only in disguises or under the cover of night, their safe houses falling one by one as informants betrayed them more. Or Death Eaters sniffed out wards that had once seemed unbreakable, and those who had survived the first war felt the repetition like a wound reopening, the same paranoia, the same silences, but sharper now, because the Ministry itself had become the enemy. its posters plastered across walls declaring Harry Potter undesirable #1, his allies criminals, muggle-borns rounded up and tried in kangaroo courts that called their very existence theft, and the Order stretched thin trying to protect them, spiriting families away under glamours, hiding children in attics and cellars, scattering people across the countryside with false names and papers conjured in haste. Kingsley Shacklebolt remained inside the Ministry at first, his position invaluable, feeding intelligence to the Order whenever possible, warning of raids, slowing down decrees, slipping information into trusted hands. But even he could not stay forever. The net tightening, suspicion thickening, and when his name was finally whispered with accusations, he disappeared into the shadows fully, taking his skill and calm into hiding, leading from the edges with coded messages and sudden appearances in places where people had thought themselves abandoned. Tonks and Lupin, now bound together by love that had survived fear and doubt, fought side by side, their union both a comfort and a risk. For every mission they undertook carried the danger of leaving their child orphaned before he had even grown. And yet they pressed on, because to stop would have meant admitting that the world Voldemort promised was inevitable. And they refused that truth even as whispers followed them, even as Lupin's old fears gnawed, even as exhaustion hollowed their faces. They carried the fire forward, passing it hand to hand when one stumbled, lifting each other in ways no spell could mimic. Molly and Arthur Weasley carried the burden of keeping their family alive while still serving the Order, their home no longer safe, raids expected at any moment. Their children scattered across the fight in different roles, and Molly's heart broke with each dawn that did not bring them all back. Yet she kept working, kept cooking, kept mending, because ordinary acts became extraordinary when performed under the weight of war. And Arthur, still at the Ministry, risked himself daily to smuggle information out, to speak quiet encouragement to those still resisting within, and together they embodied the resilience that had always made the Weasley name synonymous with loyalty. Moody was gone, Sirius was gone, Dumbledore was gone, and the Order staggered without its brightest anchors. But it did not collapse, because defiance is not the property of individuals alone. It is the inheritance of those who remember, and so they carried on. Smaller, hunted, wounded, but alive, and their very survival was an act of rebellion, but refusal to let Voldemort's world become the only world. And in barns, in basements, in ruined cottages, they gathered still, plotting raids, rescuing prisoners, sabotaging where they could, and though each mission carried risk greater than the last, they did not stop. The world around them darkened visibly, Dementors drifting unchecked through streets, the sky often bruised with their chill, muggle-born families disappearing, neighbors reporting neighbors for rewards, and fear became the most common language spoken. Yet the Order refused to speak it fluently. They spoke instead of resistance, of survival, of tomorrow, and that refusal mattered, because even those who could not fight drew courage from knowing someone still did, that the phoenix still burned even if its wings were scorched. Harry himself had vanished into hiding, his movements unknown even to the Order, and this uncertainty cut deeply, for he was both symbol and friend, prophecy and boy, and the Order longed to protect him, yet could not, and so they protected what they could, holding the line in the ways available, believing that somewhere he was still alive, still moving toward the moment that would matter. And that belief was both burden and strength, because it meant fighting on faith alone, without proof, without sight, only with memory and hope. The Ministry of Magic, once the center of their world, now issued decrees that reeked of tyranny, and each parchment nailed to walls or passed through offices was another scar on the Order's spirit. Yet they tore them down, burned them, refusing to let the language of oppression stand uncontested. And these small acts, though they could not defeat Voldemort, reminded everyone that the Phoenix was not gone, That fire still smoldered even under ash. And so through the long, dark year, the Order lived hunted, their numbers shrinking, their hope tested daily. Yet they did not break, because breaking would have meant that Voldemort had already won. And as long as one voice refused to bow, as long as one wand was raised in defense, the Order of the Phoenix still existed, and its flame, though battered, still lit the path for those who could not yet walk it themselves. Hogwarts, once the safe heart of their world, fell under new shadows when the Carrows arrived, and Snape sat in the headmaster's chair. And though the Order could not camp within the castle walls, they felt its pain in every report carried out by frightened owls or whispered by children slipping home for holidays, because the school had been their sanctuary, their training ground, their symbol of hope. And now it was twisted into something unrecognizable. Classrooms turned to cages, lessons bent into indoctrination, punishments sharpened until even laughter became an act of rebellion. The Carrows stalked corridors with cruelty painted across their faces, forcing students to practice curses meant for harm, rewarding those who betrayed their peers, punishing those who dared to stand tall. And though Snape's role remained a labyrinth of suspicion that the Order could not fully read, the truth the children lived was clear. Fear had become the daily bread of Hogwarts, and yet even here the spirit of the Phoenix flickered, because resistance does not belong only to adults. It belongs to any who refuse to bow, and the students built their own mirror of the Order, a younger echo of the same flame. Neville Longbottom, once quiet, stepped forward with a steadiness born of both loss and legacy. His parents broken by the First War, his courage hardened by years of watching friends fight, and he became the rallying point for those who could not accept Hogwarts as Voldemort's fortress, joined by Ginny Weasley with her fire unquenched, by Luna Lovegood with her strange brilliance and unwavering loyalty. And together they carried on the work Harry had begun, Dumbledore's army reborn in secret rooms and hidden passages, a child's rebellion that became far more than child's play. The Order outside the castle could not guide them directly, but word filtered back, and when members gathered in safe houses, weary from missions, their hearts lifted at the news that children were carving their own line of resistance inside the very walls Voldemort thought he controlled. They painted graffiti that shouted Dumbledore's name. They sabotaged the Carrows' cruelty. They hid those most at risk, and each act, though small, was another spark in the night, proof that the flame had leapt generations, that the Phoenix was not one circle but many, spread across ages and faces, all carrying the same defiance. The Carrows struck back with violence. Detentions that meant beatings, curses cast by teachers upon students, the castle's walls echoing with cries it had never been built to hear. But still the rebellion grew, because fear can rule for a while, but never forever, and the more the Carrows pressed, the harder the students pushed back. And when names like Neville's, Ginny's, and Luna's passed between Order members around tables, they spoke them with pride, as equals, not just as children, because these young fighters had proven themselves already, carrying the same fire their parents and brothers and sisters had carried before them. Hogwarts became a battleground in miniature, not in open war, but in daily acts of defiance. And the Order, though it grieved to hear of the children's suffering, also drew strength from it, because it meant that Voldemort had not won even where he thought his grip was strongest. And every spark inside those walls reminded the older fighters why they endured, because the future was already resisting, already fighting, already burning. And so while the Order battled in alleys and on roads, Hogwarts itself became another front, its students the newest bearers of the Phoenix Flame, proving that defiance cannot be killed, it can only be passed on. And when the final call came, these young fighters would stand shoulder to shoulder with the veterans, not as children but as equals in the fire. The call came not through parchment or passwords, but through urgency itself. A shift in the air that every member of the Order seemed to feel before words confirmed it. Voldemort was moving, his forces gathering, and Hogwarts, the castle that had birthed them, trained them, protected them, now stood as the fortress of the last stand. And so the Phoenix spread its wings once more, summoning old fighters from hiding, pulling veterans from their scattered posts, gathering them all toward the place where the war had begun for so many of them, because it was there that it would end. The students inside had already lit the fire, their rebellion carried on shoulders too young to bear so much weight, and when the first sparks of news reached the Order, Lupin, Tonks, Kingsley, Arthur, Molly and so many others moved without hesitation, arriving through secret passages and hidden doors, stepping into halls that still smelled of parchment and stone, but were now crowded with barricades, with wands drawn, with children who had chosen taught to flee but to fight, and for a moment the veterans who had lived through the First War saw themselves reflected in younger faces, the same determination, the same fear tucked behind steady eyes, and they felt both pride and sorrow. Pride that the flame had endured, sorrow that it had been handed to another generation so soon. The Great Hall became a war room, maps spread on long tables where feasts had once been laid, voices rising in planning, in argument, in determination, teachers and students standing side by side, McGonagall's stern command cutting through hesitation, Kingsley's calm voice steadying the storm, Lupin's quiet advice grounding frantic energy, Molly rallying families with a fierceness that belied her soft hands, and Tonks refusing to be left behind even with her child barely born, her loyalty burning brighter than her fear, because to her, to all of them, there was no question left. Only the fact that the castle must stand. Barricades were raised, suits of armor awakened, enchantments woven through corridors until the very stones hummed with magic, and the Order walked these halls with both nostalgia and grim focus, remembering lessons learned in classrooms now turned into strongholds, recalling laughter in courtyards now prepared for battle, and each memory fueled their determination. Because this was not only a fight for survival, it was a fight for the home that had given them everything, and they would not let it fall without fire, answering fire. As night deepened, the enemy arrived. Death Eaters massed outside the gates, giants pounding the earth with clubs that shook the ground, Dementors swirling like storm clouds, the dark mark gleaming above it all. And inside the defenders tightened their grip on wands, drew closer to one another and waited, the silence before the first strike heavier than any scream, and then the world erupted, wards shattering, curses lighting the sky, the sound of giants striking stone, and the Battle of Hogwarts began. The Order moved instantly, Moody's absence keenly felt, but his lessons living in every movement, Kingsley leading charges that struck with precision, Arthur dueling fiercely alongside his sons, Molly fierce as flame, Tonks and Lupin side by side weaving protection around those who faltered, and though they were outnumbered, though the enemy pressed hard, they fought with the fire of those who had already survived one war, and refused to let the second end in surrender. Their shouts and spells mixing with the voices of students and teachers until the castle itself seemed alive with defiance. The first wave crashed hard, stone breaking, wards groaning, screams echoing through corridors that had once held nothing worse than exams, and still the Order held, their lines bending but not breaking, their courage spreading through those younger who fought beside them. And though the night had only just begun, though loss already pressed heavy in the air, the Phoenix burned brighter, its wings spread across the castle, carrying all who stood within it, promising that as long as one member drew breath, the fight would not end. The castle shook, as if the stones themselves felt the weight of destiny. walls cracking under the force of giants, windows bursting from curses hurled like cannon fire, flames licking along the edges of the battlements, and still the defenders stood. The Order of the Phoenix in the thick of it, moving where the fight was sharpest, their wands burning light into the dark, their voices steady even as chaos swallowed the halls they had once walked in peace. And the sound of battle filled every corridor until the air seemed made of shouts and the clash of magic. Kingsley Shacklebolt commanded like water flowing, calm even as curses split the air around him, shifting fighters into positions that held the line longer than anyone thought possible, his voice carrying through smoke and fear, reminding them that strategy mattered even when survival seemed the only goal. And wherever he stood, the defenders felt steadier, their spells stronger, their courage harder, because leadership is not shouted but lived, and Kingsley lived it with every step he took through the wreckage of their school. Arthur Weasley fought with the same determination that had guided him through 2 wars, his wand flashing in patterns learned from a lifetime of care and cleverness, his sons at his side, Fred and George fighting with laughter even here, their jokes turned to taunts hurled at Death Eaters, their magic exploding with sparks that blinded enemies and lifted friends. And for a moment the air seemed lighter with them there, the twins weaving humor into horror, proving that laughter itself can be a weapon, but war is not softened by defiance. And when the explosion tore through the corridor, Fred was caught in its blast, his body crumpling as the walls themselves fell, and the Order felt the crack in its heart as sharp as the sound of stone break. Molly's cry split the night, a sound that tore through spells and curses alike. Arthur dragging himself to her side, George staring in stunned silence, the battle still raging around them as friends pulled them back into the fight, because war does not pause for grief, and yet grief pressed down like a weight. Fred's laughter silenced, one half of a whole torn away, and still they fought, because the only answer to loss was to keep standing, to keep raising wands, to make the price paid mean something in the fire of resistance. Tonks and Lupin fought side by side at first, shielding students, dueling Death Eaters, moving like partners who had long since learned each other's rhythms, but the tide of battle scattered them, pulling Tonks toward the entrance hall, Lupin deeper into the grounds, each still fierce, each still determined, and no one saw the exact curses that struck them down, only the aftermath, their bodies lying among the fallen, hands nearly touching, their faces still set with the courage that had carried them through years of hardship. And the Order wept silently even as they fought on, because Remus and Tonks had lived for love and for defiance, and now they had died for it too, leaving behind a child who would one day be told that his parents had stood until the end. The losses piled higher, Colin Creevey dragged from the field too young, others cut down in the crossfire. And still the Order pressed forward, their grief not hidden, but carried as fuel. Every fallen name another vow whispered under breath, another spark that turned pain into fire, and the defenders clung to each other, shields raised in arcs that overlapped, curses cast in unison, the rhythm of survival pounding through them like a second heartbeat, because the Phoenix had always been born from ashes, and the night was full of ash. The Order's fire burned through exhaustion, through grief, through fear, their bodies aching, their hearts breaking. And yet no one faltered, because they knew that to falter would mean surrender, and surrender had never been their language, not in the first war, not in the second, not now when the stakes were final. And so they kept moving, kept fighting, kept standing shoulder to shoulder, even as names slipped away into silence, because this was the meaning of the Phoenix, to burn, to fall, to rise again, even in the same breath. And so the night dragged on, heavy with loss, fierce with courage, and the Order endured, smaller with every passing hour, but unbroken in spirit, carrying the memory of the fallen, as they pushed through corridors thick with smoke and spells, because they had promised once that they would never let Voldemort's world become the only world, and promises once spoken bind tighter than chains. Dawn crept toward the castle like someone afraid to disturb a sick room. The eastern sky bruised and pale, the lawns torn into trenches, the air thick with the taste of dust and smoke, and still the fighting hung in the corridors like a fever that refused to break, because even when the scream of curses faded, there remained the stubborn echo of defiance. And it was in that thin light, with the order scattered through halls and courtyards, binding wounds and steadying hands, that the last circle formed, and the final story wrote itself across the stones. Harry stepping forward, not as a boy pulled by prophecy, but as a man who had walked into death and returned without it inside him. Voldemort lifting a wand that had already decided it would not obey him. The crowd holding breath that hurt their ribs, and when the lights met and turned and the green reversed and the wand flew and the body fell, the silence that followed was not relief at first, but disbelief, a stillness so deep that even the rubble seemed unwilling to settle until someone whispered that it was over, and the word over moved from mouth to mouth like a blessing that none dared speak too loudly in case the morning changed its mind. The Order stood where they were, and then they moved all at once, not toward celebration but toward work, because victory does not clear the decks, it reveals them. And they were injured to carry, fires to smother, friends to find, names to call into the new light, to see which would answer, and they did it as they had done everything, shoulder to shoulder, Kingsley directing with quiet authority that flowed into action without argument, Molly wrapping arms around strangers as if they were her Arthur, turning wreckage into levers and braces with the same quick hands that had once tinkered with plugs and radios, McGonagall closing her eyes only long enough to breathe and then opening them again to command the stairs into stillness, Flitwick propping broken arches with charms that glimmered like spider silk, Sprout pressing vials into shaking fingers, Tonks and Lupin already gone to the still room where the dead lay, their absence a hole the size of a room inside everyone who had loved them, and Fred not there to laugh at the absurdity of survival, his twin carrying silence like a weight he would bear for the rest of his life. They laid the bodies in a line that was not a parade but a promise, sheets pulled smooth, wands folded across chests, hands arranged by people who knew exactly how those hands had moved when they were alive. And in that long line, the Order saw its history written in faces, those from the First War, and those from the Second, those who had carried maps, and those who had carried soup, those who had thrown the first punch, and those who had held the door at the last moment. Because resistance is made of many kinds of courage, and the phoenix had always burned with wood gathered from more than one tree. Word of Voldemort's fall spread faster than owls could fly, carried by the breath of people who had been afraid to speak for years and now found their voices rushing ahead of them. And the Ministry, once a mouthpiece for denial and then a tool of tyranny, began to refit itself in the space of a morning. Officials emerging from corners where they had hid, others dragged out from offices where they had ruled with borrowed cruelty. And in the center of the reordering stood Kingsley. The Order's calm turned into public service, a man the fighters trusted and the frightened could believe. And though no one voted in that first hour, everyone deferred to him because leadership had already chosen him when the battle was chaos, and he had made it less so, and there would be time later for parchment and ink, for seals and speeches. But in the first day after victory, the country needed steadiness more than ceremony, and he gave it with a voice that did not waver. Funerals began before the ash had settled, because grief will not be postponed by tidy calendars. The Weasleys standing around a space where laughter used to live and learning how to breathe without it. Lupin and Tonks lowered side by side while a child slept in a house far from the castle, placed in arms that would teach him the word brave without making it a burden. Students gathered around friends whose beds in dormitories would never again be unmade, portraits bowing their painted heads, centaurs watching from the tree line with solemn eyes, house elves lining the walls of the hall they had polished for a century, with hats clutched tight and backs straight, and music rose that was not quite a song, more a hum of respect and sorrow, because words felt too small for the size of what had been carried to this shore. The order did not wear uniforms at these funerals. They wore the same robes they had fought in, scorched and mended, and the patches and burn marks told stories to anyone who looked closely, of where a shield had held, of where a curse had run too near, of where someone had thrown themselves between a spell and a friend. And those silent details became their medals, proof that they had done what needed doing without waiting for permission, because that had always been the Phoenix's way. To move first, to hold when others hesitated, to act when the price was highest. Rebuilding began with hands, not wands, not because magic could not lift stones, but because people needed to feel the weight and then feel it leave. Students and teachers and parents raising walls in the courtyards, passing buckets like they passed stories, patching roofs while telling small jokes that shook loose, tight chests. And then the wands did their work, knitting arches, smoothing floors, coaxing glass back into lead, and every repair became a thread in the tapestry of return, proof that the castle would not be left a ruin, that learning would happen here again, that shouting would belong to Quidditch stands and not to the frightened cries of midnight patrols. Inside Grimmauld Place, a strange quiet fell, not the bitter silence of before, but a tired one that felt like a house learning to unclench. The portrait of Wolberger finally muted for good, creature moving with a solemn dignity he had grown into despite his jagged beginnings. The kitchen table cleared of maps for the first time in years, and when order members sat there now they did so without looking immediately to the door, their shoulders dropping as if they were finally allowed to be the size of their bodies instead of the size of their burdens. And although the house would never be light, it softened, and in its softening it gave back something of what it had taken, a place for stories without strategy, for memory without terror, for tea that could be finished while it was still warm. Trials followed, not the mockery that had passed for justice during the occupation, but careful reckonings where evidence mattered and vengeance was kept on a leash. And the order testified when asked, not to glorify themselves but to make sure the truths of the years were set down in ink that would not fade. Names of those who had fought, names of those who had betrayed, names of those who had simply been brave without anyone noticing at the time. And in telling these stories, they stitched the private legend of the Phoenix into the public memory of a people who needed to learn how to say never again and mean it. The new world did not appear clean and shining. It grew unevenly like grass on a scar, pockets of pain and anger sprouting beside clearings of joy. But the Order understood this pace and did not rush it. They mentored new Aurors who had never seen a duel before last night. They visited families who had lost someone no one else remembered. They put away safe house keys with the tenderness you use to fold a worn shirt that still smells like the person who wore it. And they taught classrooms, ran shops, raised children, wrote letters, and in 100 ordinary acts, they made extraordinary promises that courage would be taught as patience as much as daring, that vigilance would mean kindness as much as alarms, that the measure of victory would be the quiet of those who once woke screaming. There were memorials and they mattered. Stones set into lawn with names carved deep enough that time would have to work hard to erase them. Tapestries hung in corridors where students could read the list and ask questions. Plaques on benches beneath trees that had seen both kisses and curses, and at each site the Order stood, sometimes with wands and sometimes with brooms and sometimes with empty hands, and remembered without speeches, because speeches had filled too many nights, and memory is sometimes better when it is only breath, and the sound of leave. What they built after was not a monument you can point to on a map. It was an attitude that settled into the bones of the world, a way of standing up straight in small moments, a way of refusing to laugh at cruel jokes, a way of noticing when fear starts to gather and stepping toward it instead of away. And those habits outlived the Order as an organization, which is exactly what the Order had always hoped for, that it would teach a country to hold itself upright without waiting for a handful of people to remind it. Harry grew older, and the circle around him widened to a life that was more than prophecy, and the Order watched from near and far with the pride of uncles and aunts and old friends who had once carried him through nights that tried to swallow him, and in his ordinary days they saw the proof that their extraordinary ones had been worth the price. Because the true victory of a resistance is not the fall of a tyrant, but the return of mornings where the most urgent question is whether the kettle has boiled and whether the post will bring letters instead of warnings. Kingsley's voice became the cadence of a ministry finding its spine. McGonagall's steady hands guided Hogwarts into a gentler strength. The Weasleys stitched their family back together with thread made of memory and jokes. Lupin and Tonks's son learned to walk in a world his parents had purchased with their last breath, and learned to laugh in rooms full of people who could tell him what brave looks like when it is tired. And the graves on the hill outside the castle greened over without becoming invisible because no one allowed them to. In time, the meetings ended, because there was no longer a need to whisper plans between sips of tea grown cold. The passwords faded from daily use and became stories you could share with a smile. Grimmauld Place opened its curtains to the light, and the phoenix, which had burned for so long it seemed it would never rest, folded its wings, not into death, but into watchfulness, because somewhere in every city there would always be a kitchen table where someone spread a map and said, "We cannot let this happen again." And somewhere in every class there would always be a child who asks why and then asks, "What can I do?" And in those questions the Order lived on. So the entire story of the Order of the Phoenix did not end with trumpets. It ended the way good work always ends, with people stepping back into their lives and carrying the flame quietly, ready to pass it if needed, hoping that for a long time no one would need it. And on mornings when mist hung low over the lake and the repaired towers caught the first thin sunlight, the castle looked exactly as it should, a place where children hurry to lessons and ghosts gossip in cool corridors and portraits nap in their frames. And if sometimes a teacher paused at a window and touched the stone with a hand that remembered fire, that was not grief reopening, that was gratitude settling, a simple thank you offered to walls that had listened, to names carved in granite, to a bird that had learned to rise and had taught everyone watching how to do the same.